Okay, so this slide should look familiar to you if you were in our previous session. So when I talk about social listening, there are really 4 types of social listening. And most of our time today is going to be spent talking about these 4 types of listening. And that's the level that we did not get to in our first session. So the top of the pyramid is real-time monitoring, right? That is what's going on right now, right? Who is saying what about us right now, and what do we need to do about it, right? Event-driven is more tied to an event. Maybe you go to a trade show, maybe there's a big conference, maybe there's a big press release about something, maybe your company acquired another company, right? But it's specific listening based around one single event. Then you have periodic reporting, which is like regular reporting for the purpose of tracking something over time, right? So it could be we're doing a brand dashboard every quarter. It could be we're just doing a report every month on those brand mentions and what they say about us, right? But it's a regular report that happens at a specific cadence. And then emerging trends is really kind of the bulk of it, is why it's the biggest section on the pyramid, right? Emerging trends is really looking at that. What can all of this data tell us? What can we get ahead of? What can we identify as potentially something that we are going to have to deal with a month or 2 from now? Can we get ahead of it, right? Emerging trends is really about identifying things when they are really in that germination stage, right? Okay, so we are going to go really deep on the pyramid. Just keep this graphic in the back of your head because we're going to talk a lot about it. Okay, so what can you learn with this deeper social listening? I put the pyramid up there, you see, and it's all color-coded. Okay, so this is, I promise, the worst word salad slide that you're going to see today. Again, this is basically what I just talked through, but these are the 4 levels, right? And these are the types of things that you might monitor, you might learn, right? And I point out again that that bottom layer, the emerging trends, is the type that requires the most time to do, the most data to analyze, and the most expertise, right? So I'm not going to bore you by reading this slide to you, but these are the types of things, right? So now we're going to talk about each layer of the pyramid and what some use cases could look like. So level 1, real-time monitoring, like I said, tends to be in the moment, so depending on who you are as a company, you may be doing this in real time 365 days a year, right? There are teams at big companies that literally monitor in real time 365 days a year. So this can be a lot of things related to security, right? Things are on fire, if you have a lot of manufacturing facilities. Things that your employees post from your facilities that maybe show someone doing something unsafe or something that violates a company policy. Confidential information breaches happen all the time on social media. I once had somebody post a picture of something that was literally labeled on the jar top secret. Posted it on Instagram, right? And then your executives, right? A lot of companies are monitoring the names of their top C-suite executives for security purposes. And I'm sorry to say it, but in the day when, you have people getting shot in the street for being an executive for a company, that becomes really important to the security teams. And social media can weigh into that by monitoring in real time, right? You might also use this in crisis, right? If you have a product recall, if you have another communication crisis, if there are geopolitical things happening that need to be tracked in relation to your company. It could also be something involving one of your customers, right? If the customer is important enough, maybe you're going to monitor that crisis to understand how it's impacting them, ergo impacting you. And then things like natural disasters, right? If you think about like Hurricane Katrina, monitoring what's going on, how your company's showing up, whether your people are okay, whether your facilities are okay, right? Lots of applications in crisis. And then there's all kinds of other, right? Government, legislation, local politics. Your competitors can be monitored in real time. Things that cause you reputation issues, or even just really broad topics, right? Sustainability is huge for a lot of companies. Maybe you're going to monitor the SDGs, right? Like stuff like that can certainly also be monitored in real time. So if we look at an example, and I do want to say just for clarity, these are all examples that I made up in my head. I didn't talk to somebody at Microsoft, but if I was Microsoft, right, I would be monitoring all mentions of Microsoft. And the good news about doing social listening in a more programmatic way, right, and doing it as an official activity, is that you wind up collecting one pool of data that is all of the mentions of your brand, right? So if you think of it, we'll come back to this analogy, but if you think of it as like a ball pit, right? You're collecting all the balls in the ball pit, right? You're collecting all the mentions of your company in that ball pit. And once the balls are in the pit, then you can do whatever you want. You can sort them by color. You can divide them in half, right? You can segment them out any way you want. You can filter them by size, whatever you want. But they're in the pit and then you can work with them, right? The advantage of this is because you've got one set of all the mentions, is that even if something unexpected pops up, like let's say there's a major crisis involving butterflies all of a sudden, and you're not monitoring butterflies, but you are monitoring Microsoft, right? You can easily go into your pool of data and say, all right, give me anything that mentions butterflies, and you can see what's out there because you've collected all the mentions already, right? So just collecting all the mentions of your own company, you've got a great basis, because you can then search for the name of your company and any term you want and get the results of, here are all the mentions of our company related to that topic pretty instantaneously, right? So in this case, if I was Microsoft, I was pulling all those mentions of Microsoft in, I could monitor a myriad of things, right? So I just made all these up, but we have a facility on fire. We have an employee posting about QA issues. There's somebody making a threat against Bill Gates, right? Apple made a huge announcement and we want to see how that's going to impact us, right? The Times posted a big article about us and we want, our top executives to see it, and we want to be able to tell them how, the internet is reacting to it. Maybe there's serious accusations about child labor. We want to track that, right? Or maybe there's a new law, let's say about data privacy, and we want to know how that's going to impact us. So you can see that when you have one mention or one pool of mentions, you can then slice and dice a million different ways. So you can see that by collecting one pool of all the mentions, then I can then slice and dice any way I want. So that's the first level of the pyramid. The second level is that event-driven thing, right? Which is after something specific happens, right? Could be a recall, could be a positive announcement, could be we released our annual report, could be anything like that, right? That happens in terms of an event happened and we want to monitor the response to it, basically, right? This can also happen in tandem with real time, right? So it could be that you're monitoring in real time for important people, important voices, responding to the announcement, and you're sending off that information in real time as it happens. And then you're also going to do this kind of roundup report at the end, right? So it can work in tandem. So for example, big announcements, right? Or tentpole events, right? Depending on who you are and what you do, maybe your biggest event of the year is a trade show, right? So maybe it's around a key event. And then it can be things like employees, right? Layoffs, unionizations. If you're in Europe, works councils are a huge thing, right? So the employee-related stuff tends to be stuff that happens to you versus things that you are proactively announcing and pushing out. But it is still event-driven monitoring, right? So if we look at a different example, this is 3M. This is 3M across town from us here in the Twin Cities, right? 3M is a broad, diverse, global company that does a bunch of stuff, right? But again, if you think about that pool, if I collect all mentions of 3M, I can then use it to do things like report on the reaction to our annual report or our quarterly earnings or an acquisition announcement. I can use it to analyze a rumor that's circulating that we're going to do big layoffs, right? I can monitor CES, which is a huge event for 3M every year, right? 3M has their own events. Young Scientist Challenge is a really cool one. And then the 3M Open, which is a golf event, right? So they're going to monitor around those events. And then, of course, negative things like a lawsuit or an NGO that attacks you. But all of those things can be done by event-driven reporting. It's kind of like a one-time or maybe two-time reporting around a specific event. Make sense? All right. Third level, periodic reporting, right? So these tend to be the leadership reports, right? The ones where the leaders go, can we get a quarterly dashboard on whatever, right? That's this, right? And so this can be as simple as, here's what the volume of mentions about our company look like and what topics are circulating or what the sentiment is, right? It can be something really basic like that. It can be something like, let's demonstrate the impact of what we're doing on social. Or it can be on a number of other things, right? Depending on what's interesting to your company, right? You can monitor periodically against your key competitors, right? You can monitor customer insights, right? You can do pretty much anything you want on a regular basis, but the real point here is to track it over time, right? It's something where we want to keep an eye on it, where we want to know how it's changing from quarter to quarter or month to month, right? It's something where we want to have that historic record of data, right? And it's something that needs the visibility of a quarterly dashboard or something like that, right? So this can be very broad, right? And you can use it in a bunch of different ways. But periodic reporting for most larger companies ends up being a thing because the executives want pretty easy to digest dashboards, right? Okay, so if we look at General Motors as our example here, right? I'm collecting all mentions of General Motors in my pool of data. And so that means that I can do reporting on, say, quarterly brand reputation or what I'm getting from social in terms of ROI. Or let's say I'm one of those companies where like employee culture is really, really, really important. Maybe we do a quarterly dashboard on employee activity on social and employee sentiment, right? All of those types of quarterly reports, regular reports, would come out of that pool of all the mentions of General Motors, right? But what if in addition to that, I also want to do a quarterly report about tracking my competitors or tracking my key customers or tracking things like consumer preferences on car color, right? That would require me to then add to my pool of data different data, right? So that's information that now is going broader than people talking about General Motors. This is stuff that's more topical in nature and not tied necessarily to mentions of my company. So this is where when you think about your pool of data, you would be adding, right? So you'd have all your mentions of General Motors, and then you would add additional sets of data to cover these types of topics, right? And I will say, when you start into this part of social listening, this is when you start dealing with more data, way bigger data sets, a lot more work to do the analysis, right? And a lot more hours required and a lot more expertise. So as soon as you get out of that pool that's just your own brand mentions and you start adding these more topical data sets, that's when the labor goes up. That's when it gets really skilled. That's when you really do need some heavy expertise. Otherwise, you can just end up drowning in data, right? And then the bottom level, emerging trends. So I think that it's really interesting. I said at the beginning, right? This is not a crystal ball. It's not magic, right? But at the same time, you can use social listening to try to identify things before they become huge things, right? Before they become a full-blown crisis situation. And I think a lot of companies are interested in this because obviously you would like to be able to avoid or better prepare for crisis situations before they happen to you, right? That makes a lot of sense. So the main goal here, right, is can we identify the issue when it's still just a sprout, right? When it's just a little bit, And this is really difficult to do well, right? You really do need some expertise. And I will point out, you need people doing this work that are experts in social listening, but also experts in your business. And that's a hard thing to find sometimes, right? But if you can spot the issue here, that gives you lots of lead time to either do something to squash it, right? Or do something to prepare for when it gets big, or to at least like prepare your messaging or maybe build a page on your website so that you can defend yourself, right? It gives you more time, which in a crisis situation can be super, super valuable, right? By the time it gets in the middle, by the time you start to see petals, right, then you're in a place where maybe you have time to jump in and do something proactively, but you might be in that place where you just have to react to the situation because it's moving too fast, right? And so this notion of can we capture it when it's small and get ready for it is really, really key. It's hard to do, but if you do it well, you can avoid getting to this stage at all, right? And the thing we really want to avoid is waiting till here, right? Because once it's full blown, you're in the middle of a crisis and you just have to go, right? And you just have to do the best you can. So emerging trends is all about trying to figure out things before they become big things, right? And this can require a lot of poking around, like needle in the haystack kind of stuff. And it can require some good intuition, right? You know, okay, I saw 3 different posts that mentioned this thing. Maybe that's something we should look at, right? And so it requires a little bit of what I call cyber sleuthing. It requires cyber sleuthing skills, right? And it requires somebody who can connect the dots, right? And go like, oh, I saw this and I saw this. Maybe I should run a search on my pool of data to see how much of that there is, right? And if it's been growing over the last year. That's the kind of stuff that you're looking for in emerging trends. Remember, it's not magic. So I have definitely done projects where I have analyzed millions of pieces of data and come out with, yeah, not really, as the answer, right? Or we can't tell. That is also a possible answer, right? And so when you're setting up this type of listening, especially with internal stakeholders, it's really important for them to understand that the data is the data. And once you do the analysis, the answer may be fuzzy. The answer may be, we can't tell yet. We'll keep an eye on it, right? But it's not just, again, press the button and magical things happen, right? That is not how this works. Number 2 is you have to remember that when you're doing analysis like this, you are talking about millions of data points. And I can tell you from personal experience, anytime you're looking at multi-million sets of data, it's a lot of data to crunch through, even with the tools to help you, right? And so you can end up drowning in data if you don't know what you're doing. And you can also end up honestly looking at like way more data than you need to because you don't know what you're doing, right? And so this requires the highest level of expertise, the highest level of skill, and the highest level of kind of acumen in this whole space, right? And then because you're dealing with millions of points of data, it's also a massive time suck, right? This can take hours and hours and hours, right? And so it's not the kind of thing that companies want to start doing lightly and without proper resourcing, right?